Hi, everybody. We're going to try to get started. So I'm really excited about tonight. Davis and I were talking this winter, or this fall, about who we'd like to have come and speak to you all. And we always try to have one night with someone who maybe is a little bit unexpected, maybe not as known to the food movement, but who does work that we think is both exciting and relevant to what we're all trying to do. And I think many of you know this, but not all of you don't know this. My background is in conservation, land conservation. So my kind of spiritual connection to agriculture comes from my belief that farmers are the best stewards of the land and really are our only hope for saving the planet and for doing conservation well. And so I'm super excited to be introducing my friend Sanjayan. Sanjayan and I worked together for several years at the Nature Conservancy. And Sanjayan is now the CEO of one of the most important global conservation organizations in the world, Conservation International. And I asked him to come here and talk to us tonight and to help me think about the bridge between agriculture and conservation and how we might all be a part of that. So we spend a lot of time talking about building a bigger coalition to advocate for food. And Sanjayan is an incredible marketer, an incredible communicator, and really passionate about issues that we're passionate about. He holds a doctorate from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he studied gopher genetics. And he also has a celebrity talent agent. And I would argue that he's the only person in the world who has those two things. Sanjayan has hosted documentaries for PBS, BBC, Discovery, and Showtime. And as I said before, it's just a longtime friend. So we're going to talk tonight about conservation, about agriculture, about marketing, and we're going to invite all of you to join in the conversation. So think about what you'd like to talk to Sanjayan about. We're going to kick it off by sharing a video that Conservation International produced as part of a campaign to get people emotionally connected to conservation.
I am the soil. I am in the hills and in the valleys, the farms, the orchards. Without me, humans could not exist. But you treat me like dirt. Do you realize that I am just a thin skin on this planet? And that I'm actually alive? Full of organisms that grow your food. But I am broken, aching, overused, sick because of you. You have withered me away to less than half of what I used to be just over 100 years ago. Are you paying attention? I am turning to dust. So maybe you could treat me with a little more respect. I suppose you still want to eat, right?
Love it. So Conservation Organization is thinking about soil, which is great. So could you just start off by telling us a little bit about what Conservation International does? And then maybe pivot and talk a little bit about soil and how you all think about soil.
Great. Thanks, Jill, and thanks to all of you for being here. This is really exciting because I get to learn a lot about something I know very little about from all of you as well. So I hope it's a two-way conversation. So I've been the CEO of Conservation International for all of about 172 days. So all of this is a bit new to me. They haven't fired me yet. It was all good. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary as an organization, actually 2 nights ago in New York City. So we were founded on a really simple premise that people need nature to thrive, that these two things are inextricably linked, that saving humans really is about saving nature, and saving nature is really also about saving humans. They're two sides of the same coin. That ultimately it's in our enlightened self-interest to actually save nature. So around the world, mostly in tropical countries, we tend to work in places, we tend to demonstrate why saving nature is beneficial to people, right? So that's what we always try to do. So let me try and give you a little, and just to give you a quick size of the org, we have about 1,000 staff, most of them in faraway places. We have a very light footprint in the United States. We don't work on the continental North America, mostly because there's so many great organizations already at work here, including the Nature Conservancy, for example, plus 3,000 other land trusts. We tend to work in quite faraway places like Liberia and Suriname and Brazil and Indonesia and Madagascar and Kenya and Botswana and South Africa. And in these places, we're always trying to create models of sustainability at scale. So that is, part of it's protecting nature, but part of it is also creating this value chain within a project so that ultimately people will act in their own enlightened self-interest and protect it for themselves, right? So when you do international conservation, if my model of trying to affect change in Liberia is trying to take money from you and then take it all the way over there and give it to someone who doesn't have as much in order to influence conservation, I can't scale that. So ultimately, I have to figure out a way to use your private philanthropy to get communities over there to actually sort of get into a different model of thinking about nature, whereby you're giving some mechanisms and some tools, but ultimately they are protecting those places, whether it's forests or rivers or coral reefs or fisheries or the soil, in their own interests. We work with companies, we work with governments, we work a lot with communities, particularly indigenous communities. Most of our staff are from the countries that we work in. About 90% of our staff are actually from those places. Half our staff are millennials. We have a great board. We're not a membership-based org. We have almost no endowment. So every year the lights go out and we start running to raise money in order to do the work we do.
So you're talking about work all over the world. I'd be interested to hear places where you've seen examples of farming that you think is harmonious with nature and is helping you achieve your biodiversity goals, and maybe places where you've seen farming or ranching that's not so great. And are there places you've seen change, and how has that happened? And so kind of what is the role of the farmer in the different places you're working when you think about conservation?
So, I have to keep reminding myself in this conversation because, Jill will frame it as farming particularly, but I'm thinking about it as people who are using the land in some kind of agricultural fashion. So I'm thinking about everyone from coffee farms that we work with, or coffee growers around the world, to fisheries, to aquaculture, right? So I'm taking that whole spectrum. Where it's not working, it's pretty easy, a lot of places. That you don't need, you almost any place you go, you can very quickly see things that are happening, and you start digging in and you realize, wow, the system is so set up, it's so skewed already that even to affect change that is positive is going to be massively difficult. I just got back from Botswana. So, it's not typical farming country in terms of crops, but it is cattle country. And the entire system there is just so prejudiced against local communities who own cows. And it's very difficult to turn that thing over. So, in the 1960s and the 1970s, the European Union, trying to help Botswana, decided they're going to create a giant cattle market in Botswana. If you spend a lot of time, any time in Botswana, first of all, it's probably not great cattle country. But more problematic, what they did was they realized that if you're going to get meat coming out of Botswana and going into the European Union, they needed to keep animals, cows, livestock, small, everything from sheep to cows, away from wildlife because of things like foot and mouth disease. Now, foot and mouth disease doesn't impact the meat you eat, but it does impact dairy production, right? So the Europeans did not want that anywhere near them. So what they did is they fenced the whole country up. They divided the country into wildlife zones and into cow zones, basically. And, first of all, ecologically, it was a gigantic disaster because overnight, tens of thousands of wildebeest can't migrate anymore. It's a water-scarce country, and they get stuck on the fence. So you think, okay, well, we lost this huge amount of wildlife. Well, did it help the people? It didn't really help the people. So listen to this. Botswana has about 300,000 people who own livestock. That's the country only has 2 million people. It's a huge wildlife rich country, but it's got about 2 million people. So they have 300,000 people who own livestock. Of those 300,000 people, we think only 700, let me put that again, only 700 out of 300,000 have access to markets.
That's crazy.
Okay? Because most of the people who own cows are poor, are black, are community members, and they are in the wildlife zones. And they can't get their cows out of that zone. So the market that they have is just sort of this weird internal market. They're kind of selling a little bit to each other, but there's no way to offtake it. There's no way to basically get that meat out of there into the European market. And the people who have that market don't really want anyone else in it, and it's kind of like skewed towards either commercial farmers or rich people or, you know, in some ways connected people. Let's just leave it at that. Corruption is a very low problem, frankly, in Botswana, but this is just sort of historic prejudices that are in place there. So trying to overturn that is very difficult. So as a conservationist, you go into that landscape and you start talking to people about wildlife. You know, their first thing is like, I mean, literally a guy said this to me, a chief said to me, I'll care about your rhinos when you start caring about my cows. So you really have to start asking, well, how can I create a market for this person before I can really talk about soil health and carbon and better grazing practices? Because there's no point in building there's no incentive to build any of that up, because there's no market for those animals. So we had to sort of really think about how to disrupt that whole thing from ground up. And for us, what it eventually came to being was to create a way of having mobile auctions and a mobile abattoir, where you are not taking the cows out of these zones, but actually bringing the butcher shop, if you will, to the communities and to the cows. And in that way, for the first time ever now, we're actually having a market opening up for farmers, ranchers in this case, to actually have an incentive to graze better, to have better herd management, but also now care about conservation, because now they actually kind of get it, right? They can actually sell. I mean, I was telling Jill this is just insane. I just got to mention this and then I'll stop. But like, if you go to Botswana, if anyone of you lucky enough to go and stay in one of the lodges there, or even if you had a Kruger National Park, Kruger is probably the most famous national park in all of Africa. The lodges there go for like, the cheapest will be like $1,000 a night. And they go up to like $2,500 a night. Okay? You go in there and you get beef. You can get beef, you can get mutton, all of that. That beef comes from hundreds of miles away. In fact, one lodge we surveyed actually was bringing its meat in from Norway. From Norway. And yet, literally 6 kilometers away, there's a fence, and then there's like dirt poor people and like loads of cows. For the first time ever this August, we had a sale of cows from the community into 20 lodges within the park. And so now you're making that connection happen. But that system, you know, it's very difficult to overturn it. So the problem that I see around the world, I mean, Jill was right. You want to like solve conservation problems, you know, you really have to think about ag or farming in some shape or form. It's the #1 predominant land use pretty much in any country we work in. Finding good examples are rare. And when you try to overcome the bad examples, the system is so stacked against you that you really have to be subversive in a lot of ways in order to get in there. It took us 10 years to actually figure this out. Like we tried everything and then finally figured out a way to actually start to overturn what's an ancient system. If you want some countries that I think maybe kind of getting it sort of, you know, Rwanda is doing some pretty cool stuff. You know, Sri Lanka, which is the country of my birth, you know, does some pretty interesting stuff. You know, on a Western scale, I mean, you know, Holland, you know, the Netherlands, I mean, does some amazing stuff in terms of agriculture. Here's a country that's fraction of, it's fraction of the United States, and yet it's, I think, the #2 exporter of farm produce after the United States. So they're clearly doing some things right.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask you to talk like conservation philosophy in the U.S. So you studied with Sule, who is known as a wildlands guy. So some of the young farmers here and I have talked about how could we open more parklands at the local level and the state level to create land access for young farmers, because it's an enormous challenge. The cost of land for these young folks we work with who are trying to start a business is a real barrier. But there's still little bit of a philosophy or a fear from a lot of the conservation people who we work with about agriculture and nature. So can you talk a little bit about what you think about that and your own personal shift? So he was like, let's put wildlands aside and then we don't use them. They're separate from people. And I feel like part of your evolution as a thinker and a scientist has been about, no, it's about working lands.
Sure.
So, and how could we be influential as we're trying to get more of this land to be stewarded by farmers?
Yeah, I mean, the second part of that question is quite difficult, but you guys probably have some ideas about it as well. So, look, when I came to the United States, I came kind of naively thinking that I'm going to work with wildlife. I actually wanted to study cheetahs in Africa, not gophers, cheetahs. And because I grew up in Africa.
I like that better.
I was born in Sri Lanka, I grew up in Africa, and so I had this, like amazing thing that I was going to sit under, like this acacia tree on top of like a Land Rover wearing like khaki and a gin and tonic in my hand and my Swarovski binoculars, and I'd be watching cheetahs on the plains of Africa, exactly what you see on TV. And I almost had it. I had the whole thing laid out. I had my project, everything. I had funding. And then, believe it or not, it got nixed at the very last minute. I was actually in Washington, D.C., and I was getting a visa to go work in Namibia, a research visa, when I got a phone call. It actually didn't get the phone call. The hotel said to me, there's a message from your advisor, Michael Soule. He wants to call you. And I had to literally go across the street to a payphone. Remember those things? They're they used to be these red things that were in corners. You put money in, and then you pick up, and you dial like this. And you had a book, and you had numbers on there. I had to say this because you guys are young farmers, so I kind of have to, I know I have to explain things like phones. Okay, so you pick this phone up, I call Sula, and he's like, yep, project's been canceled. And I said, why? And he said, the pandas. Literally, he said, the pandas. I said, pandas. Long story short, but Bruce Babbitt, who was the Secretary of Interior at the time, canceled my project because there was a kerfuffle with these pandas that were coming to the San Diego Zoo from China. And World Wildlife Fund actually put up a stink because they thought they were paying the Chinese $1 million for these pandas. They were worried that people were going to go catch pandas in the wild and bring them to the zoos. And so Babbitt put a halt to it. But my money for my project, which had nothing to do with pandas, it was to do with cheetahs, was coming through from the U.S. government, was coming through the San Diego Zoo to me. So I'm there, my visa's ticking out. I had to find something, literally in California, looking around, what could I do, what could I do? And everywhere I looked, I could see gophers. Gophers.
This is
so
really sad.
This is maybe I could do this. There's got to be something to do with gophers. And I talked to my advisor, and he said, believe me, I kid you not, he said, go watch Caddyshack. And it's sort of true. It's actually sort of true. These are really hard animals to catch, as probably many, many, many of you know. But I really empathize with every one of you because instead of sitting on top of a Land Rover with my gin and tonic at sunset, watching across the African savannah these beautiful, majestic spotted cats, I spent most of my PhD like this, on my knees, digging in the dirt. And damn, is it hard. Here's the thing with gophers. So
really?
So gophers, and the reason why this makes sense, it wasn't that stupid. So I was trying to look at energetics in cheetahs, because cheetahs live on the very edge of their energetic it takes an enormous amount of energy to just get fast enough to catch something, as fast as a pronghorn, and in that case, as fast as an antelope in Africa, right? But gophers do as well. So gophers, the majority of gophers die because they can't dig efficiently enough to get food. It turns out it costs 3,000 times more energy to dig underground than it is to move the same distance above ground. So these little creatures that you may ignore or may think are a pest, which they probably are really at the absolute tolerance level in terms of energetics. So you can learn a lot about genetics and energetics and all of that. So that's why I did that. But here's the reason why to catch these gophers, I had to go meet farmers. And that was my first exposure to farmers in California, who were more than happy, really, Central Valley farmers of California were so happy to see me because I would pull up in my pickup truck. I got an Australian Shepherd because I knew that was a great intro, right? like I'm sensitive to my color of my skin and all that, and going and knocking on doors, right? So I like send the dog first, then I get out, then I walk in and I knock on the door and I say, I want to catch gophers off your land. They're like, come on in. And I became really quite well known in that, in the valley. I could go up and down California catching gophers.
Has anyone heard of Sanjayan catching gophers?
It made it. How many of you are from California? You're not going to believe this, but I managed to get the picture of a gopher in the front page, above the fold, of the Sacramento Bee. Probably the first and only time ever that's actually happened, right? It was way before Trump, really slow news. They were happy to put a gopher up there. What most of these farmers did not know, and I didn't really tell them, that later on I would come back and release these gophers back onto their land. Because my whole study was a catch and release study. Right? So there was a bit of that. But I really got to know people, and here was the big transformation that happened. So I came to study wildlife, but when I talked to these people, I realized that they had a deep appreciation for their land. They had history, they had culture behind them, they had an appreciation for the land. They knew things like the first day of frost and how late it was this year compared to last year. They knew about the pests. They knew about wildlife on their land. You know, not always antagonistically either. Whether it's the whippoorwill or whether it's the barn owl or whether it's... And they got to know that I like to see these things, so it would be kind of a little game. I'd show up, catch the gopher, then they'd invite me for like to stay a little longer. We'd walk around, I'd get on the tractor, I'd sort of ride around the property with them and see things. And it was just this big shift that I had around that time when I realized that, you know, I went to UC Santa Cruz, which actually has a pretty great agroecology program. But most of conservation at the time really had a, I guess, sort of a Western land ethics sort of bent to it, which wanted, you know, land to be in wilderness, away from people. And you know, I don't think anyone said to me, farmers are the enemy or anything like that. But that prejudice was certainly within the conversation of the people that I would hang out with. And it changed during those 3 years of being on those farms and ranches and talking to people and sort of understanding what they were trying to do. And I realized it's exactly the same thing as the folks I grew up with in Sierra Leone and Sudan and Kenya. You know, people just want to try, people want the opportunity to have a slightly better life. And they want to be able to do it without exhausting the basic fabric of nature that everyone appreciates having. And most of the time when you're exceeding those limits, you're doing it because you don't believe you have any other choice or alternative. So I think that's how my transformation happened. Believe it or not, catching a lot of gophers, you kind of get closer to God.
Do you think that scientists or farmers make better observations about nature?
I think the old, like, so if you really go back in history, most great natural history sort of scientists were farmers in some shape or form. I mean, like, think about like the pigeon breeding that Darwin did, you know? I mean, they all observe, I mean, Mendel, like, you know, that's like growing peas and observing and then keeping records and then tracking it and keeping more records. And he did that. He figured out genetics before we even knew that there was things like DNA. He didn't actually know how it was happening. You could just see the phenotypic, exhibition of it out there, right? So I think, I don't think you can split those two apart. I think now we are splitting it apart, but I think that's how it all came about.
So you got the gopher above the fold in the newspaper. Yeah. Which leads me into a question about your ability as a marketer and communicator. So one of the challenges in the food movement, and some of the people in this room are excellent at this, but one challenge we often have is how do you simplify the message about what's needed in agriculture, and how do you really emotionally connect people to the issues we're facing? They can be abstract. So I want you to talk about kind of your gift of taking complex issues and making them accessible or making them emotionally relevant. Like, how do you think about that? How do you get somebody interested in the kind of work you're doing in Botswana? And what advice would you have for us as we try to get more people to care about sustainable farming? Like what? Okay. And you're new to it, so like as you're talking to people here today, and to me, what resonates about the story we're trying to tell?
Okay, it's a big question. Jill's got these amazing, well-prepared big questions. I have really simple answers. I mean, I don't have, I want you guys to understand that it's not like I have, like, worked this out. by any means, right? I'm struggling just like you are in my own field. I will tell you that storytelling can change the world. That there are, you really look, think about a guy like Steve Jobs. And he comes to mind because of that film that I just showed you, and I'll tell you the connection there. Steve Jobs, one of his great genius was storytelling. Like, he could convince his company and his people and his board and people like that to see the world in a slightly different way through the power of narrative and the power of storytelling. It is very, very powerful. It's a very powerful device that we have in order to affect change. And those who can often tell stories better can actually win the day. And I think that one of the challenges we have with any kind of, no, I shouldn't say with any kind of movement, but maybe speaking more specifically about this. Most of you got into what you're doing, I would suspect, not because you wanted to be great storytellers. You got into it because you had a love for the land, or love for animals, or love for growing things, or contributing, or wanting to be part of a community. It was really those sorts of reasons. And all of you are probably amazing farmers who are doing amazing things in your community or in your space. But it's not enough. It's not enough if you want to. It's enough if you want to have a happy life, probably. But it's not enough if you want to affect change at scale. To do that, you actually have to become storytellers too. And you've got you've got it stacked against you, right? Because you've got giant companies that have gigantic amounts of budgets and staff and all of that who are telling their story. And let's be honest, most of the time they're winning. I mean, they make big boneheaded moves too, but for the most part they're winning. That's sort of why we are in the state we're in. So you have to realize that your job isn't just to grow things in a regenerative way or to have a role in community. It has to go beyond that now. I would love nothing better than to go study animals or save animals. That's what I want to do. But it's not enough. I can't just do that and think that's going to do it. I have to then start thinking about stories and how that narrative is going to make it. I mean, I have to think of lots of other things too, but that's a big part of it. So I truly believe storytelling is a really big part of it. And I think we tend to believe that evidence will help us convince people to do things differently. But there's no evidence of that, right? In fact, it's actually the exact opposite. Like, why we buy shoes for $200 that don't make us run any faster. We do many things that are really bad for us, and we know they're bad for us. But we'll still do them because of the story to tell our heads or what we want to do. So you have to figure out ways to tell your story. And you have a very powerful story to tell, right? You're kind of doing a fundamental thing, a fundamental good, a fundamental building block of human civilization. You're participating in that. It's a great story to tell. You just have to figure out very creative ways to tell that story. And don't think that the data is what's going to make that. I mean, it's a big challenge with climate change. We talk about data, but it's like it goes right over people's heads. You really want to go emotional. You want to hit people at their heart. Frankly, I also think that's why we've had some success with the sort of the movement we're in right now. Like, people are kind of buying in, at least to some level, about food and about health and about connections to nature and things like that. I mean, I go to my local farmers market in Virginia. It's actually considered to be one of the oldest farmers market in Old Town Alexandria. There's actually a corner there where George Washington used to sell his wares. Think about that. How cool is that, right? George Washington came down 8 miles on his carriage and sold his stuff right there. It's just packed. It's packed. People sort of are starting to get. There is absolutely a revolution around food happening in this country. We also need to make that global. So, I mean, we can talk a lot more about storytelling and what works and what doesn't, but for me, I truly believe it's really important, and it's really important to think about what you do in those sorts of narratives. And if I could get Go First above the fold of a newspaper, I know you can do even better with what you're working on, to be honest.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, then we're going to go to the audience. What does the sustainable future look like to you? So what's the best case scenario given biodiversity loss and climate change and destruction and weather and all the bad news we're getting? What's your hopeful best case scenario?
My hopeful best case scenario, I think, is very possible. Look, transformation on the planet can happen very quickly. And there are lots of things that I didn't think it would happen that fast, right? So think about this moment we're in. We have 198 countries who've signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement. The only country that's not signed up is the United States. But it's very likely that we're still going to meet the United States targets in spite of the federal government being against it in this moment. That's amazing. In fact, I kind of like that because it means that it probably will stick even after we've had, whatever we have in terms of political change. So, movements can work. People can, like in that case, it was cities, mayors, states, industry. What an amazing moment that was, right? The day after the White House announced they're going to pull us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, we had 200 companies take out an ad in the New York Times saying we're still in it. And you had companies as diverse as Patagonia and Disney, or as Walmart and Tiffany's. It was an Exxon. We had everyone. That was like a big breakthrough movement, frankly, for the environmental movement, because for me, I realized, people are starting to say that this is not, these are two sides of the same coin. We do need jobs, we do need to feed people, we do need better lives, but we don't need to do that at the expense, of nature. And you guys are on the forefront of that. The challenge that you have, frankly, is how you scale that and how you demonstrate that at scale. And I think that the place, in this country, the real power is really shifting into mayors and cities, right? So these rural-urban boundaries and sort of that level of government is getting enormous amounts of energy and value. And you guys, many of you are probably right in the intersection of that. So, I'm buoyed by the possibilities of change. I'm quite hopeful at the speed at which things can transform. Clean energy. The rapidity with which clean energy is taking over this country is like a tsunami, a tidal wave. The amount of investment that's going into it today. That's unstoppable. We haven't built a coal-fired power plant in the United States since 2008. Not because of regulation, because it doesn't make any economic sense anymore. And it's only getting cheaper every day. We need that same kind of revolution to happen to food. We need to have the same kind of revolution happen to conservation. And it's very possible. So you can hit tipping points, you can make it go fast. At the very end of the day, my goal, my hope, is that we can show at scale, at the scale of, say, West Papua, Northern Sumatra, or Alto Mayo in Peru, at some landscape scale. I could say Hudson Valley, but I just don't know this area very well, maybe at that scale. That people can expect a slightly better life than their parents. They don't even want that. Most people don't. They just want the opportunity for that. People can have the opportunity for a slightly better life than their parents without destroying these fundamental building blocks of nature that is not only good for local communities, but is globally hugely important.
Who's got a question?
Hi, thank you for coming and speaking. Sort of a simple question, but I'm going to ask it because I didn't quite hear it. How does, in a meaningful way, biodiversity become a goal of agriculture, or what conditions do you feel need to be in place for biodiversity to become a goal of agriculture? Thanks.
That's a really great question. Probably three ways. The first that I can just think of right off the top of my head, there's probably lots more. The first is that we are starting to gain a much greater appreciation, given all the challenges facing the planet, of the need for just biodiversity to be maintained in terms of crop diversity, in terms of animal diversity, in terms of sort of seed diversity, and things like that. So there is starting to be appreciation that just because you have the highest yield monoculture right now doesn't mean that with a little change on the planet, that is going to work in the future. And I like that. I think that gives us an entry into it. There is a growing appreciation that biodiversity as a whole makes systems more resilient to change, like climate change and things like that. So lots of companies, organizations are investing in it because they can see that resilience, whether it's with coral reef systems or tropical forests and pollinators and so on and so forth. The third is, I think, in the actual farming methods itself that you're using and what you're bringing to table and what you're bringing to the market. There is, in mixed systems, you can maintain some level of biodiversity within the landscape, or at least you can, you can maintain some level of biodiversity in the landscape and still have a meaningful yield and still have a meaningful way of making a living. Mixed crops, for example, in Kenya allow elephants to pass through without destroying any single crop, much better than having one monoculture, which the elephants just target and go nuts on, right? So there's like ways in which you can actually enhance both. If there's one area of biodiversity and food production that I would love to see explored more, it would be marine aquaculture. So, one thing, think about how old farming is on the planet. And it's very, very possible that the first types of farming that humans did actually included aquaculture or marine aquaculture, mariculture. It's quite possible we did. You go to the Hawaiian systems, it's really demonstrable how the Hawaiians absolutely farmed the ocean in some very, very clever way. They'd grow yams on land and take them out to sea and drop them in specific places mixed with this red coral to attract fish that they would come and collect at certain times of the year. They had all these seawalls that were built that would allow fish in and not out and all this sort of stuff. That's how they could maintain a population of over 1 million people on the Big Island, right? But that has completely dropped from our psyche. So if you think about the fish that we farm in marine systems, there's like a handful. They might not have been the best. So I think there's a huge area of scientific research that needs to happen with marine aquaculture if we're actually going to feed the world and maintain biodiversity and do it, not just salmon farm to salmon farm to salmon farm in silly places, which just doesn't make a lot of sense, and part of it is because there's so much interesting and weird regulation in the United States that it's very difficult for universities to actually do that research at scale. So.
Will you say your name too?
Davis Lindsay. It's my understanding that Conservation International was founded off of the theory of biodiversity hotspots from Dr. Mittermeier. Could you talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms used to make those measurements of hotspots, and if that type of measurement could be replicated in agriculture, and is that the way to scale agroecology?
That's a really good question. I've never had anyone ask that question before. That's just really well put, and now it makes me think maybe you could. So the original hotspot papers were Russ Mittermeier, as well as a lot of other scientists who basically asked, what are the places on the planet that have, originally was the highest amount of plant diversity and facing the greatest amount of change in terms of deforestation or loss. So the hotspots were defined by having lots of diversity, in the original case, plant diversity, but also under great threat. And that's how they were determined. And Conservation International focused probably half its life trying to protect that. But somewhere along that path, and I wasn't at the organization at the time, our founder, Peter Seligman, really had an epiphany that we were defending these small refugia, but really blind to the giant forces that were swirling around us. And that unless we were able to actually engage at that scale, engage about human life, human existence, economic well-being, those refugia would just be that bit of an arc. And so we changed our mission. We changed our mission to really think about saving nature for people and integrating the two. So today, when I report to my board on our progress last year, I'm reporting two different indices. I'm reporting an indices on nature and biodiversity and wilderness and all of that, but I'm also reporting on jobs, I'm reporting on health, I'm reporting on water, so I've got a set of human metrics as well. I think it makes more sense for us to do that because that's the only way we're getting resonance in some of these really faraway places where people are dealing with existence and they're asking, well, how do I put my resources into it? But your question about could we create, agricultural hotspots, that's a great idea, actually. And you could get probably a lot of interest in a major paper and get kind of that spotlight on regions around the world. And there's some movement to do that kind of work, but to do it in a systematic way, it's quite good.
Thanks, Sanjayan. My name is Jack Algier. My question is, do you have a formal process for problem solving with partners that you work with globally? And do you have any examples of what those might be? If you're working with governments or...
Do we have a formal process for working with partners? So partnership's a big deal for Conservation International. About 35% of the money we raise goes out to partners. We probably have about 2,000 partner agreements around the world, and it actually is a fair amount of work to kind of maintain those partnerships and maintain those relationships. But in a lot of the places, the people who are actually doing the work on the ground are not our staff, they're partner staff. And so funding them and finding ways to do it is important. So we have a whole sort of office that thinks about partnerships and works on them. A formal process for partnerships, I can't easily define one. The big partnership we have, like with education, so we have a big partnership with Arizona State University, because they have a huge school on sustainability, with MIT, because they do a lot of stuff on everything from AI to research, with Google X, so we have those formal things, but process-wise, no. I will tell you one process that we're now starting to institute, which is a process of rapid eval. So we've sort of taken that out of some of the partnerships we've done. And we do have an internal process to rapidly evaluate new ideas and quickly determine whether we're going to go the next step and invest in them or kick them out. So, that's probably all I can really confidently say we have. If I tell you anything more, I'm probably, it's probably not quite there.
Is that science or strategic?
It's both, so the rapid eval sort of prototype we got, like we literally got from Google X, and we've sort of modified it to use it for our work. So it involves both, quick data analysis, but it also involves other things like never having the people, like never hiring staff, permanent staff to take on new ideas. Like always using either consultant, like always using someone who will be safe in terms of a job, even if we decide that project is not going to go forward. It's having a devil's advocate within the project whose job is, and they get rewarded for figuring out why it will fail. So it's about stripping down so the way we came up with this mobile abattoir idea, which, believe me, in Africa, lots of conservation orgs have worked on the cattle issue. I've never seen anyone come up with this mobile auction combined with a mobile abattoir. And I think the only reason we came up with it is because we prototyped and prototyped and prototyped and stripped everything away and ultimately got to where we wanted to get to. Yeah, there's a lady right there.
Ladies first. Hi. My name is Lilian Ruiz, and I worked in soil health before. In your video, if I weren't in public, I would be sobbing. It's very good. My question to you is, it's very interesting what you say about motivation and about evidence. It's really hard to find a story good enough for soil health because the process is slow, right? It's not the same as, you don't see how many gallons of water you wasted, or it's harder to measure and it's harder to tell the story. Can you tell me something in terms of evidence and storytelling that works for soil health?
Ooh.
Nothing?
I wouldn't say there's nothing. I'm sure there's plenty. I just, I probably haven't thought enough about it. So these videos were part of a series called Nature's Speaking. And they came about because we got into amazing collaboration with a guy named Lee Clow. Lee Clow was the marketing genius for Apple, who did every Apple commercial all the way through the iPad. And he's the one who did that Think Different campaign and really radical stuff, right? So when we took this to him, he said, well, what happens if nature was speaking directly to you? And so we have a whole series of videos, all narrated by A-list movie stars. This one was Edward Norton, for those of you who might have recognized it or didn't. But we have Julia Roberts doing one on, as Mother Nature. We have Reese Witherspoon. We have, Harrison Ford, et cetera, et cetera. But we didn't want to show their face. We did because it isn't Edward Norton actually telling you. It's the soil telling you about it, right? So, and it's a bit contrary. It's not quite comfortable. It's got this weird tagline like people don't need nature doesn't need people. People need nature. Which not everyone loves. So it worked for a lot of reasons, and now it's in foreign countries in lots of languages. On soil health, the one thing that I'll point to very rapidly. So I do think there is. I'm seeing it more. I'm hearing about it more. But the place where I'm hearing a lot about it is about carbon and soil. So that definitely is now in the consciousness, at least of some level of governments and institutions. And I think that can go really far with it, right? So the amount of carbon in soil is dramatic. You can increase it. You can tip the balance in terms of carbon dioxide dramatically by changing the way you graze or till or plow or destroy soil. I suspect that we're not very far away from some level of a globally agreed to price on carbon. It probably will happen in Europe. It probably happened first with the airline industry because airplanes are flying about as efficiently as they can, so the only way they can mitigate even more is to actually just buy carbon credits. And, there's so much, as I said, money going into energy, alternate energies and clean tech, that the money now the return on investment is different. So we're going to go into soil carbon very quickly, I think. And I think that's probably your best entry point into having that conversation.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Adrian. I appreciate your Botswana example, and especially the first one where it was much more of a prescriptive, we are going to create this marketplace for you. Through this conference, I think there's been a focus on how do we not tell Indigenous nations, First Nations, what they should do, but actually listen to them and help empower and catalyze the knowledge that they have developed over thousands of years. As someone who works on such a global level, working with a lot of Indigenous cultures, how's your organization really changed from being prescriptive to really listening and working with?
That's a great question. It's a really important question, especially when you are not in your backyard. And let's be honest, we're almost everywhere. We're foreigners in a foreign land or strangers in a strange land. So we have a very strong set of policies about free, prior, and informed consent when we work with Indigenous people. We have a whole office of over 30 folks who work on Indigenous issues. The head of our team for Indigenous issues is also the chairwoman for Indigenous issues with the IUCN. So she has sort of global standing on it. We've had Indigenous people on our board, so that becomes quite an important place for us. The way, and you're completely right. So if you go back a little bit and look at how Indigenous systems, so I was, recently in Brazil or in the Amazon. So in the Amazon, you have this system where you probably had 100 million people living in the Amazon basin, pre-Western contact. Even by the time like the conquistadors and stuff were in there, disease had already wiped those communities out. And if you go back just a little bit further than that, you realize that the very earliest explorers who were going down the rivers there weren't even able to pull onshore and camp because there were that many communities. They would camp on islands in the middle of the river, right? And you ask, well, how were they doing all of that? And it was because they had an ingenious form of adding nutrients and carbon into the terra preta, ingredients into the soil in an area which is very, very poor in soils. The Amazon is actually fed from the Sahara. Right? The Sahara is actually what provides the minerals that the Amazon needs to thrive. You can in fact, one place in the Sahara, in Niger, is where the majority of the dust comes and goes over the Amazon and then comes down as nutrients. Yeah, you can actually quite clearly define it. So you have this nutrient poor area, but you still support 100 million people. And now people are starting to understand that. So one of the things that, for example, in the Amazon we're doing is we're working on what we believe is the largest tropical reforestation project on the planet. No one has done tropical reforestation at scale. 1,000 acres is considered a very, very large project. The reason is because of biodiversity. Every acre of tropical forest is different from the next acre around. And the way we're doing it is entirely using an indigenous system of farming, of planting. So we've got indigenous communities, and mostly the women in these communities, that collect the seeds. It's a mix of seeds from the community, from the forest. And then that's mixed in with peas and maize and a couple of weed species, quite literally. And that whole mixture is then spread out on the landscape. So initially you get the peas growing quickly, and then you get the corn quickly growing. But after like year 3, you've got the now indigenous trees now at like that high. And by 7 to 10 years, you almost can't tell that it actually was completely denuded land. And that system of restoration, we're totally learning it from indigenous communities. So there's an enormous amount. Because I mean, think about how long people have been farming, right? And they've been doing that and they've been working under extraordinary circumstances. So I completely agree with you. I think it's a shame that we've lost so much knowledge there. But what we have, we now absolutely need to promote. If any of you ever get a chance and you're down in Brazil, there's an amazing chef talking about chefs, by the name of Alex Atala, and I've become really. Has he been here?
No.
You got to have him here.
Yeah,
He has. He's pretty cool. So this guy made me a dish made of ants, which didn't taste like ants. It actually tastes like mushrooms. His dish made of mushrooms actually tastes like ants, but that's another story. But he's an amazing chef. And he's made it his life mission now to bring these foods from the Amazon. And that's what he does. And he's got, obviously, an amazing restaurant called DOM in Sao Paulo. Yeah. But yeah, so that definitely is there. And it's fantastic to sort of recreate that.
Great. Cool.
We'll take one more question.
It's a hand way back there. Should we try and get that or no?
Good job.
Between cleaner energy and some AI developments and cellular agriculture, which is, I guess, more commonly known as petri dish meat, which technological developments, and some of them I'm reluctant to call advancements, I just call them developments, are you concerned would make your work even tougher? And which do you anticipate making your work easier?
What a great question. You guys are like asking these questions like Fast Company or something like that. They're such great questions, but they require like a lot of thinking, right? I mean, it's like that's a really, really smart question. So, I think there's a lot happening in the ocean space in terms of science, in terms of mariculture and all of that. I think that could potentially make my life a little easier. The traceability of things is becoming important now. And we're very, very good now. We're getting very clever at tracking things from, farm to table, so to speak. Again, in Brazil, I visited a project we're doing with crabs, with crab fisheries. And we have a system where we can literally track a crab from the mangrove swamp to table, using cell phones. So every step along the way, from the community that's collecting the crabs from the swamp outside of Belém, right outside the mouth of the Amazon River, all the way to the restaurant can be tracked. And it's basically double the income for this community and giving them incentive to protect about 5,000 acres of mangroves, which is the equivalent of like 1.5 million cars. So that's going to make a big difference. I think there's lots of innovation happening in finance and people getting better at understanding the value of ecosystems and ecosystem services and finding ways to capitalize on that and de-risk these projects and sort of be creative, marrying technology and to make my life easier. We've got a project in northern Kenya where we're coupling solar cells, Tesla Powerwalls, and a new desal plant to desalinate 10,000 gallons of water from the ocean that is now being sold, will be sold under purchase agreement to the hospital and to the military, both which need clean water consistently, the proceeds of which half will go to the community and the other half will go into a fund for conservation. That's really clever stuff, right? So, I mean, I love that kind of thing. What's going to make my life, and connectivity. I mean, it's amazing that we can run an international conservation organization, engage local communities in Samoa, and make that sort of work because of the connectivity that we have. We also have this amazing power of getting the word out in lots of ways. It's both good and bad. You know, that film's been seen 70 million times. You know, you can't even imagine that in any other world, right? You know, the one that, you know, I think everyone talks about this, and I don't think it's any you know, you would be surprised by this, but I think AI does change everything, you know, in a very fundamental way. Like if you think about almost every technology that we've had, like the steam engine coming along, for example, or the combustion engine coming in to play, and, you know, 2 million people who took care of horses out of jobs in America all of a sudden. Big protests because there's now a new technology that's taking away horses, right? Those people who were doing that job or that sector moved into a different kind of service. Like they basically went into building roads at that point. They went into building infrastructure for the cars. So every sort of technological revolution has allowed whoever was involved in that, when they lose that job, to get into another job that's created by it. AI is different. AI doesn't take out people who are working, you know, in sort of, you know, just in jobs that are like, you know, building roads or taking care of horses or anything like that. It also takes out the brain surgeon. It takes out the radiologist. It takes out the pilot. It takes out very highly skilled jobs as well. So the disruptive power of that is actually quite frightening, and it's really quite unknown what it actually will lead to. I don't think anyone can actually predict it.
Joe, we have one more question in the back.
Great.
But hey, you know, one thing, which is the one place where I actually think, even with AI, you can make some money. Because you won't have a job soon, right? Because it'll, like AI and robotics will do everything, is art. I think art is still outside of AI because it's such a subjective thing. You know, you had a painting that we don't even know if Da Vinci actually painted, being sold for $450 million, right? It's now in Abu Dhabi. That's amazing. I don't think AI gets rid of that. I'm sure you can have an AI painting that's amazing, but it's subjective. So the subjective things are the things that will last. You know, new inventions in cooking that could still last, whereas everything else is kind of gone.
My name is Ikama. I'm originally from West Africa. I was born and raised Niger, between Niger and Mali. Wow. And my parents from Mali. And thank you for great work for Africa. And I have two questions regarding livestock. I'm actually a farmer. I have 5 acres and I need 2 cattle. I took 2 trips this year for my livestock. And my first question is, what is the best way for African livestock farmers to success or to develop more? And the second one, do you think your organization will extend it rest of part of Africa to help them to success?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great. And thanks for being here from a long way away. I grew up in West Africa, but not in Niger and Mali. I grew up in Sierra Leone. But, you know, I sort of got a feel for it. So, you know, people joke and sort of joke and say if you want to save wildlife in Africa, you have to worry about the 2 C's, charcoal and cattle. Because it just, you know, really, you know, sort of colors land. So 50 million people are small-scale farmers. They produce most of the food in Africa. Many of them have also livestock on the side. I think the big challenge with livestock, you know, and or farming in Africa is access to markets. And I think that if you don't fundamentally find a way to change that, you know, that internal market of selling to one another, it doesn't give you enough incentive and drive and momentum to make a huge difference. So, you know, I'm not the livestock expert, but that's sort of what I notice and what I see. I think that, when you look at drought, when you look at climate change and the impacts of climate change, and particularly on Africa, and the contributions Africa will have to make to also reducing its carbon emissions, I think taking care of grasslands and rangelands is going to be hugely important. And in that sense, livestock can be used as a very powerful tool to transform places into more productive land. So you guys are familiar with Alan Savory and some of his work. I've spent a couple of weeks with him in Zimbabwe and seen what he's managed to do. It may not work in every system, but it certainly, from what I could see, it looked like it was really making a difference there. I think the second part of your question was about my organization. So we work in about 7 countries in Africa. We do work on this thing that is more multi-nation. We have a program called the Gaborone Declaration for Sustainability, which involves about 14 countries around Africa that have all agreed at the presidential level to include nature in their development plans. But only 1 or 2 have really started to implement it. That's a big play. It's a long-term play. It's probably in the right direction. But at this point, we don't really work ourselves in sort of the Sahel countries. That's just capacity.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you so much. You answered
This is
an
great. You
amazing
guys are
range of
fantastic.
questions. Thank you. Really appreciate you being here. So Sanjayan, we'll hang out for a little bit. There were several questions we didn't get to, so we'll just be here if people want to come up and talk.